All right, so why do I think that real estate is one of the best wealth building tools out there? Leverage. So what I mean by that is when you think in physics, leverage is a force applied to usually like a lever that applies more force to another object. And then in finances, according to Investopia, it talks about having debt used to be able to get further returns, to be able to service debt at a higher rate. So those are some things to take into consideration about when you're using leverage, that you want to use funds to be able to grow bigger funds. So here in a real life example, so we bought our property in North Carolina back in 2020, and we bought it for 282,900. Okay, so that's a purchase price. We only had to come to the closing table with $3,000. Well, why? Because we used the VA loan. So the VA loan didn't have us put down a down payment, and so really it's just and we could have even come to the closing table with $0 if we would have been able to negotiate zero closing costs. But story for another time. So let's use that example. Okay, so we had 3,000 that we applied to be able to get an asset that's worth 282,900. Now, the example I want to compare it to is the stock market. There is nothing wrong with the stock market. We invest in the stock market, but it's just another kind of like diversifying your portfolio, I guess. So if we were to have that same 3,000, historically, the stock market has returned about 10% per year. So if you're looking back at like the S&P 500, that index over like the last 30 years or whatever it might be, it's about 10%. You can have other sources that will differ on it, but that's the general idea. We're just trying to have simple numbers here. So 10%. So after 1 year, you're going into the second year, you would have 3,300 because of that 10% is 300. Adding that to what you had in your principal moving forward, that's the 10% ROI for that year. If we were to use that same example that we had here for our real estate, we had that same 3,000, but then we bought an asset that's worth 282,900. Well, real estate, maybe 3, maybe 4%, depending on what the market is. But again, over the decades, historically across the nation, real estate appreciates at about 3, maybe 4%. So let's just use that 3 to 4% rule. So if we were at 4% of that 282,900, the appreciation or the growth is based on the asset, not the 3,000 that we put in. So that's a form of leverage right there. We had that 3,000, but we're not getting an ROI based on our 3,000. We're getting an ROI based on the 282,900. So what that comes out to after that year at 4%, it's about 11,316. Okay, so then we are able to compound that year over year, right? When we grow that, in the stock market versus here in real estate. And so that's just a really simple example, of course. And then if we had to come to the table with the traditional 20% down payment, it would still be the same concept. We're looking at that same, if we had about roughly 60,000 that we needed to come up with, and we had that in the stock market, that 10% versus that 60,000 we put into this asset, it would still be growing at that same rate at the 4% on the actual purchase price and the value of the home, not on what we brought to the table. So that's just a really quick example for us about how we use leverage. And of course, real estate is just one of the many tools out there to build wealth on top of just investing in the stock market, opening a business, running a business, whatever it might be for you. So there's no right answer, so to speak. But real estate, I just wanted to highlight, is an incredible tool to use, especially in the form of leverage.